Alright, hello everybody, this is AW here with Chaya and Joshua, and today we're reading Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Bane to any anti-third worldist, anti-post-colonial theorist, and all-around general anti-id-polar. You know, the usual typical Marxist leftist. But anyways, we started recording this, and then the thing I was recording to is really stupid, so we're going to start in a little bit in. We're about 5 pages in. So you haven't missed much, and if you think you've missed much, well, you go ahead and you read those 5 pages, buddy, because I'm not rereading that. But I will reread this last paragraph, the second paragraph on page 4. This is, by the way, the Richard Philcox translation, because it's a really nice paragraph. So, starting on that, the, quote, native, end quote, sector is not complementary to the European sector. The two confront each other, but not in the service of a higher unity. Governed by a purely Aristotelian logic, they follow the dictates of mutual exclusion. There is no conciliation possible. One of them is superfluous. The colonist sector is a sector built to last, all stone and steel. It's a sector of lights and paved roads, where the trash cans constantly overflow with strange and wonderful garbage, undreamed of leftovers. The colonist's feet can never be glimpsed, except perhaps in the sea, but then you can never get close enough. They are protected by solid shoes in a sector where the streets are clean and smooth, without a pothole, without a stone. The colonist sector is a sated, sluggish sector. Its belly is permanently full of good things. The colonist sector is a white folks sector, a sector of foreigners. The colonized sector, or at least the native quarters, the shantytown, the medina, the reservation, is a disreputable place inhabited by disreputable people. You are born anywhere, anyhow. You die anywhere, from anything. It's a world with no space. People are piled one on top of the other, the shacks squeezed tightly together. The colonized sector is a famished sector, hungry for bread and meat, shoes, coal, and light. The colonized sector is a sector that crouches and cowers, a sector on its knees, a sector that is prostrate. It's a sector of niggers, a sector of towelheads. The gaze that the colonized subject casts at the colonist sector is a look of lust, a look of envy, dreams of possession, every type of possession, of sitting at the colonist's table and sleeping in his bed, preferably with his wife. The colonized man is an envious man. The colonist is aware of this as he catches the furtive glance, and constantly on his guard realizes bitterly that, quote, they want to take our place, end quote. And it's true, there is not one colonized subject who at least once a day does not dream of taking the place of the colonist. So just to summarize what the last 4 pages were about, this is basically a chapter. This chapter is called On Violence. It's the first chapter of the book. It's basically talking about the violence of colonization and the reflective violence of decolonization in turn. Colonization begins in violence. Decolonization, of course, then must also end in violence. There is quite a bit. There was at least one allusion about the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, about how the colonized subject becomes a human, becomes man, only through the decolonization, the struggle of decolonization. So, alright, let's continue. This compartmentalized world, this world divided in two, is inhabited by different species. The singularity of the colonial context lies in the fact that economic reality, inequality, and enormous disparities in lifestyles never managed to mask the human reality. Looking at the immediacies of the colonial context, it is clear that what divides this world is first and foremost what species, what race one belongs to. In the colonies, the economic infrastructure is also a superstructure. The cause is effect. You are rich because you are white. You are white because you are rich. This is why a Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched when it comes to addressing the colonial issue. It is not just the concept of the pre-capitalist society so effectively studied by Marx, which needs to be re-examined here. The surf is essentially different from the night, but a reference to the divine right is needed to justify this difference in status. In the colonies, the foreigner imposed himself using his cannons and machines. Despite the success of his pacification, in spite of his appropriation, the colonist always remains a foreigner. It is not the factories, the estates, or the bank account which primarily characterize the ruling class. The ruling species is first and foremost the outsider from elsewhere, different from the indigenous population, the others. So, I mean, there's obviously a common point made against orthodox Marxism, which is economic determinism does not actually explain everything that goes on in the whole project of colonization, the whole factors, the way racism plays out. There are many things in which it seems to just straight up be a matter of race, a matter of just this arbitrarily made and established distinction of inferior and superior, in which, even the poorest white is better than the most intelligent, black, so to say.
And I think the economic determinists neglect the point that even when Marx was talking about class, he was talking about a social relationship. Like, it wasn't this thing where, like, okay, your income is, determines whatever. It was that social relationship which defined the class. So, like, I mean, I think Fanon is definitely correct, and I think that the economic determinists don't really see that if they're just measuring everything by how rich you are, or, what you're, where you work, or whatever, like.
Yeah, it's not always about income. There are social privileges accorded to you as a white person, which have nothing to do with the fact that you're a capitalist or a proletarian. The fact that you're white gives you automatic privileges over and above, somebody who's black. So there's definitely independent factors, and usually the conversation there is taken back to, well, ultimately, this all rests on the original distinction between class, material class. And they will then say, well, this is no longer to do with capitalist class, but it goes back to feudal classes or, slave classes, the distinction of those classes, right? So, I think they have some counter arguments, but I think oftentimes they're quite weak.
Well, I mean, the thing, of course, about this issue is you need to remember that social capital derives itself from, economic capital, derives itself from social capital. So obviously, in a society which favors white people are going to be richer than black people.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it derives from social capital, but is definitely parasitic on social capital. You can get capital without having social capital, and then capital itself can give you social capital, but sometimes one of them is far more determinant than the other and enables the other. So, continuing. The violence which governed the ordering of the colonial world, which tirelessly punctuated the destruction of the indigenous social fabric and demolished unchecked the systems of reference of the country's economy, lifestyles, and modes of dress, this same violence will be vindicated and appropriated when, taking history into their own hands, the colonized swarm into the forbidden cities. To blow the colonial world to smithereens is henceforth a clear image within the grasp and imagination of every colonized subject. To dislocate the colonial world does not mean that once the borders have been eliminated, there will be a right of way between the two sectors. To destroy the colonial world means nothing less than demolishing the colonist sector, burying it deep within the earth, or banishing it from the territory. So, I mean, one example I think that can bring it home to at least people in the U.S. is the example of the riot. What happens in a so-called riot, or at least more specifically race riots, so-called. The oppressed populations in this country go out and just smash shit up and fuck shit up, and people are like, "Why are you destroying these stores that you go to? Why are you looting Walmart? Why are you destroying the bank? Why are you doing this?" Well, guess what? Because they're seen as the colonizer. They're seen as the oppressor. It's not me. It's like I don't know I don't own the bank. It's not my uncle's bank. It's not my people's bank. It's the white man's bank, right?
Well, I think it was someone online said this years ago when George Bush came to visit Uruguay. There were riots on the streets, and the first thing that the rioters were attacking were the McDonald's. And you had that whole connotation there between the United States, this big imperialist power, and McDonald's, the symbol of imperialism, so to say.
Yeah, definitely. And so, I mean, I think there's a Fanon here is definitely describing a view which the oppressed have in general, in which you destroy what appears to you to be the domain of the other, the domain of the oppressor. Why is it that people in a riot literally destroy their own communities? Well, because they don't actually see it as their own community. In fact, I mean, they don't own the houses there. They live there. They're forced to live there, but it's not really home.
Yeah, what always pisses me off when people, complain about the riots is, they don't care about the violence. They care about the oppressors. I mean, the oppressed rising up. Because they even complain when they merely, take a knee when the silly song is played. Or they even say anything about the discrimination going on.
Yeah.
It's not about the violence. It's about the oppressed rising up. That's what they're really upset about. Because they know that, they're not the oppressed. They're the oppressors.
Actually, I disagree with that, because I think most people are literally just ignorant as fuck and don't realize that they have anything to do with it, But what they get pissed off about is, hey, you're making me think about things I don't want to think about. How dare you make me think about politics when I'm watching a stupid football game? I want to be entertained. I don't want to be have the serious world thrown in my face. How dare you? I don't want to go to a Kanye concert and have him go on a spiel about Donald Trump and about how America stole, the white man stole the black man's music or whatever. So I want to go be entertained. It's basically the complaint is you're making me uncomfortable, and you're making me you're forcing me to pay attention to things I don't want to pay attention to.
I mean, American culture is very apolitical in general. I mean, it's, most Americans just don't give two shits about politics.
Yeah, pretty much. So yeah, so far I think Fanon's not really giving some kind of theory for what people should be doing. Just kind of describing the reality of how people feel in these situations. There's a deep resentment towards the oppressor, towards the colonizer, and of course you'd expect that. I mean, you'd have to be an idiot not to expect that. So continuing. Challenging the colonial world is not a rational confrontation of viewpoints. It is not a discourse on the universal, but the impassioned claim by the colonized that the world is fundamentally different. The colonial world is a Manichaean world. The colonist is not content with physically limiting the space of the colonized, that is, with the help of his agents of law and order. As if to illustrate the totalitarian nature of colonial exploitation, the colonist turns the colonized into a kind of quintessence of evil. Colonized society is not merely portrayed as a society without values. The colonist is not content with stating that the colonized world has lost its values, or worse, never possessed any. The native is declared impervious to ethics, representing not only the absence of values but also the negation of values. He is, dare we say it, the enemy of values. In other words, absolute evil. A corrosive element destroying everything within his reach, a corrupting element distorting everything which involves aesthetics or morals, an agent of malevolent powers, an unconscious and incurable instrument of blind forces. And Monsieur Meyer could say in all seriousness in the French National Assembly that we should not let the Republic be defiled by the penetration of the Algerian people. Values are, in fact, irreversibly poisoned and infected as soon as they come into contact with the colonized. The customs of the colonized, their traditions, their myths, especially their myths, are the very mark of this indigence and innate depravity. This is why we should place DDT, which destroys parasites, carriers of disease, on the same level as Christianity, which roots out heresy, natural impulses, and evil. The decline of yellow fever and the advances made by the evangelizing The decline of yellow fever and the advances made by evangelizing form part of the same balance sheet. But triumphant reports by the missions in fact tell us how deep the seeds of alienation have been sown among the colonized. I am talking of Christianity, and this should come as no surprise to anybody. The church in the colonies is a white man's church, a foreigner's church. It does not call the colonized to the ways of God, but to the ways of the white man, to the ways of the master, the ways of the oppressor. And as we know, in this story, many are called, but few are chosen. So that analogy of DDT and Christianity is is interesting, to say the least. I wonder if this was at a time in which it was already being found out that DDT was highly carcinogenic. Or mutagenic, at least. It caused a lot of mutations when it got concentrated up the food chain. Because then it'd be an even more apt comparison.
The white man's ideology mutilates the colonized.
Yep. Deforms them.
Mutates, I mean, not mutilates.
Yeah, mutates. So I don't know what he means by Manichaean.
Manichaean, he means a duality of good versus evil. Because the Manichaeans were a Gnostic sect that came out of Persia, I believe. And they believed in a duality of a good god and a bad god. They were very influenced by Zoroastrianism, and I don't recall what else I read about them, but yeah, it's just basically that duality, good versus absolute good versus absolute evil.
All right, cool. Thank you. So continuing, sometimes this Manichaeanism reaches its logical conclusion and dehumanizes the colonized subject. In plain talk, he is reduced to the state of an animal, and consequently, when the colonist speaks of the colonized, he uses zoological terms. Allusion is made to the slithery movements of the yellow race, the odors from the native quarters, to the hordes, the stink, the swarming, the seething, the gesticulations. In his endeavors at description and finding the right word, the colonist refers constantly to the bestiary. The European seldom has a problem with figures of speech, but the colonized, who immediately grasp the intention of the colonist and the exact case being made against them, know instantly what he is thinking. This explosive population growth, those hysterical masses, those blank faces, those shapeless, obese bodies, this headless, tailless cohort, these children who seem not to belong to anyone, this indolence sprawling under the sun, this vegetating existence, all this is part of the colonial vocabulary. General de Gaulle speaks of, quote, yellow multitudes, end quote, and Monsieur Maurac of the black...
Mauriac, I think.
Okay. Of the black, brown, and yellow hordes that will soon invade our shores. The colonized know all that and roar with laughter every time they hear themselves called an animal by the other, for they know they are not animals. And at the very moment when they discover their humanity, they begin to sharpen their weapons to secure its victory. As soon as the colonized begin to strain at the leash and to pose a threat to the colonists, they are assigned a series of good souls who in, quote, the symposiums on culture, end quote, spell out the specificity and richness of Western values. But every time the issue of Western values during the period of decolonization, the colonized are called upon to be reasonable. They are offered rock-solid values. They are told in great detail that decolonization should not mean regression, and that they must rely on values which have proved to be reliable and worthwhile. Now it so happens that when the colonized hear a speech on Western culture, they draw their machetes, or at least check to see they are close to hand. The supremacy of white values is stated with such violence. The victorious confrontation of these values with the lifestyle and beliefs of the colonized is so impregnated with aggressiveness that as a countermeasure the colonized rightly make a mockery of them whenever they are mentioned. In the colonial context, the colonist only quits undermining the colonized under the latter, once the latter have proclaimed loud and clear that white values reign supreme. In the period of decolonization, the colonized masses thumb their noses at these very values, shower them with insults, and vomit them up. Reminds me of your video on third worldism, Chai.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess you could say it's a battle of truth. Your third world colonized truth versus the first world colonizer truth. That's way oversimplified, I'm sorry. But the general idea there is,
Yeah, seems pretty close. Continuing, such an occurrence normally goes unseen because during decolonization, certain colonized intellectuals have established a dialogue with the bourgeoisie of the colonizing country. During this period, the indigenous population is seen as a blurred mass. The few native personalities whom the colonialist bourgeois have chanced to encounter have had insufficient impact to alter their current perception and nuance their thinking. During the period of liberation, however, the colonialist bourgeoisie frantically seeks contact with the colonized elite. It is with this elite that the famous dialogue on values is established. When the colonialist bourgeoisie realizes it is impossible to maintain its domination over the colonies, it decides to wage a rearguard campaign in the fields of culture values. It is that the immense majority of colonized peoples are impervious to such issues. For a colonized people, the most essential value, because it is the most meaningful, is first and foremost the land. The land which must provide bread and naturally dignity. But this dignity has nothing to do with human dignity. The colonized subject has never heard of such an ideal. All he has ever seen on his land is that he can be arrested, beaten, and starved with impunity, and no sermonizer on morals, no priest has ever stepped in to bear the blows in his place or share his bread. For the colonized to be a moralist quite plainly means silencing the arrogance of the colonists, breaking his spiral of violence, in a word, ejecting him outright from the picture. The famous dictum which states that all men are equal will find its illustration in the colonies only when the colonized subject states he is equal to the colonist. Taking it a step further, he is determined to fight to be more than the colonist. In fact, he has already decided to take his place. As we have seen, it is the collapse of an entire moral and material universe. The intellectual who, for his part, has adopted the abstract universal values of the colonizer is prepared to fight so that the colonist and colonized can live in peace in a new world. But what he does not see, because precisely colonialism and all its modes of thought have been seeped into him, is that the colonist is no longer interested in staying on and coexisting once the colonial context has disappeared. It is no coincidence that, even before any negotiation between the Algerian government and the French government, the so-called liberal European minority... Dang it, my thing turned off again. Sorry about that. Let me restart that sentence. It is no coincidence that, even before any negotiation between the Algerian government and the French government, the so-called liberal European minority has already made its position clear. It is clamoring for dual citizenship, nothing less. By sticking to the abstract, the colonist is being forced to make a very substantial leap into the unknown. Let us be honest, the colonist knows perfectly well that no jargon is a substitute for reality. The colonized subject thus discovers that his life, his breath, his breathing, and his heartbeats are the same as the colonist. He discovers that the skin of a colonist is not worth more than the natives. In other words, his world receives a fundamental jolt. The colonized revolutionary new assurance stems from this. His look can no longer strike fear into me or nail me to the spot, and his voice can no longer petrify me. I am no longer uneasy in his presence. In reality, to hell with him. Not only does his presence no longer bother me, but I am already preparing to waylay him in such a way that soon he will have no other solution but to flee. The colonial context, as we have said, is characterized by the dichotomy it inflicts on the world. Decolonization unifies this world by a radical decision to remove its heterogeneity by unifying it on the grounds of nation and sometimes race. To quote the biting words of Senegalese patriots on the maneuvers of their president, I think that's Senor. We ask for the quote, we ask for the Africanization of the top jobs, and all Senor does is Africanize the Europeans, end quote. Meaning that the colonized can see right away if decolonization is taking place or not. The minimum demand is that the last become the first. On this demand, and in fact, there seems to be no lack of. The colonized, however, equate this nepotism with acts of sabotage, and it is not unusual to hear them declare, quote, "What is the point of being independent then?" End quote. Continuing. Wherever an authentic liberation struggle has been fought, wherever the blood of people has been shed, an armed phase has lasted long enough to encourage the intellectuals to withdraw to the rank-and-file base, there is an effective eradication of the superstructure borrowed by these intellectuals from the colonialist bourgeoisie circles. In its narcissistic monologue, the colonialist bourgeoisie, by way of its academics, had implanted in the minds of the colonized that the essential values, meaning Western values, remain eternal despite all errors attributable to man. The colonized intellectual accepted the cogency of these ideas, and there in the back of his mind stood a sentinel on duty guarding the Greco-Roman pedestal. But during the struggle for liberation, when the colonized intellectual touches base again with his people, this artificial sentinel is smashed to smithereens. All the Mediterranean values, trinkets, all those discourses appear a jumble of dead words. Those values which seem to ennoble the soul prove worthless because they have nothing in common with the real-life struggle in which people are engaged. So what do you feel about this so far, Josh?
I think I agree with him.
You agree with the rejection of Western universal values?
Yeah, I think I do.
I think the real problem is just who really is willing to fight for universal Western values, I guess. I think that's like the real hurdle when you're talking about applying these values to elsewhere in the world. Places that see Western universalism as something foreign to them, and who still rely on tribal or ethnic or religious loyalties over a sense of universal brotherhood. I mean, I don't think these things are impossible to overcome, but it is just something to keep in mind. So
yeah, I think even Westerns don't believe in Western universal values. I mean, shit, we have no solidarity with ourselves. Let alone, solidarity with the Chinese, solidarity with the Africans. I mean, when was the last time, there was a major strike in China and, anybody in the U.S. when it's like, we'll strike with them too. It just doesn't happen.
I mean, even the third world doesn't really have any solidarity with each other unless they can connect it to something like religion or a shared ethnic or a background or something like that. I mean,
yeah, being a worker is not exactly a unit. It's not this abstract universal in which we can all recognize ourselves as workers. It's like, we all have a shared fate. In reality, the working class itself is differentiated against itself. There are elements of the working class which are opposed to other elements of the working class.
I think also with the Western values thing, I think Zizek might have mentioned this, but most of the people who say they're fighting for Western values are like not fighting for Western values. Like all the right-wing people you hear who say they're defending Western values from immigrants or whatever.
Well, that's the thing, like, when the alt-right says that they love the West, they don't really love the West. Their quote-unquote love of the West is really just motivated by their hatred for immigrants.
Yeah, they don't actually love what makes the West good. They just love their white skin color and their pretty white children.
Sounds pretty third worldist to me. The alt-right, the third world of the first world within the first world. It's the third world white.
Yep.
The alt-right is just decolonializing Europe.
Well, that's what I think is so, I guess you could say paradoxical, is that you see, I guess you could say, like, a lot of these post-colonial or post-modernist tropes in the rhetoric of these white supremacists. Like, they always want to say, oh, well, we're being colonized. Oh, our Western values are being phased out by these invaders. I mean, there is a big sense of irony there.
Yeah, it's kind of hilarious. Like, they see these downtrodden immigrants, but they're like, oh no, we're the oppressed ones because white women like BBC or whatever.
Or those liberal cultural Marxist professors are forcing diversity on us, or no.
Yeah, it's really just silly.
So yeah, I mean, like, it's also the case that I think he sees an anti-capitalist character to certain third world, so-called, pre-Western or un-Western cultures, in which the hyper-individualism that's required for capitalism is not all-pervading in non-Western cultures. They're actually pretty communal.
Yeah.
They're a lot more in tune with nature. All these things, capitalism can't abide that. You can't do business with those people. Actually, something like half a year ago, I forget why I got interested. Something came up about like Native Americans and the whole cultural necessity for capital to change the culture. Marx calls it the compression of time, the ontological compression of time. The necessity to regiment, to set things on schedule. And I read something about Native American cultures and how a lot of Native American cultures just do not have that kind of lifestyle. You couldn't even give them a free factory and say, here, be capitalist and create your own capital. They don't see life that way. Why? Why am I going to work here every day, 8 hours a day on the clock? I gotta go do, yeah, sure, I can go to work, but, I need my little siesta, at 10 a.m. And then, I need my break. And then I need to go to do this, at the community center and have a little chat. And then, come back and work for another 2 hours. And then after that, we go and have dinner and, do whatever. They have their own sense of time. And, you can't just, hammer them in and just give them a factory and say, here, produce, make profit. It just doesn't happen. And that's part of what capital hates. Capital can't stand people like that, doesn't want people like that. It needs to, totally dominate their cultures, to bring them into its own regimented way of living.
Yeah, they definitely must have really had to fight when they took over the Incas, since if you know anything about the Inca Empire, they were pretty much communist.
So, alright, let's continue. And first among them is individualism. The colonized intellectual learned from his masters that the individual must assert himself. The colonial bourgeoisie hammered into the colonized mind the notion of a society of individuals where each is locked in his subjectivity, where wealth lies in thought. But the colonized intellectual who is lucky enough to bunker down with the people during the liberation struggle will soon discover the falsity of this theory. Involvement in the organization of the struggle will already introduce him to a different vocabulary. Brother, sister, comrade are words outlawed by the colonialist bourgeoisie because, in their thinking, my brother is my wallet and my comrade, my scheming. In a kind of auto da fe, the colonized intellectual witnesses the destruction of all his idols, egoism, arrogant recrimination, and the idiotic, childish need to have the last word. This colonized intellectual, pulverized by the colonialist culture, will also discover the strength of the village assemblies, the power of the people's commissions, and the extraordinary productiveness of neighborhood and section committee meetings. Personal interests are now the collective interests, because in reality everyone will be discovered by the French legionnaires and consequently massacred, or else everyone will be saved. In such a context, the every man for himself concept, the atheist form of salvation, is prohibited. Self-criticism has been much talked about recently, but few realize that it was, first of all, an African institution. Whether it be in the Dejemas of North Africa or the Palavers of West Africa, tradition has it that disputes which break out in a village are worked out in public. By this, I mean collective self-criticism with a touch of humor because everyone is relaxed, because in the end, we all want the same thing. The intellectual sheds all that calculating, all those strange silences, those ulterior motives, that devious thinking and secrecy as he gradually plunges deeper among the people. In this respect, then, we can genuinely say that the community has already triumphed and exudes its own light, its own reason. But when decolonization occurs in regions where the liberation struggle has not yet made its impact sufficiently felt, here are the same smart Alecs, the sly, shrewd intellectuals whose behavior and ways of thinking, picked up from the rubbing shoulders of the colonialist bourgeoisie, have remained intact. Spoiled children of yesterday's colonialism and today's governing powers, they oversee the looting of the few national resources. Ruthless in their scheming and legal pilfering, they use the poverty, now nationwide, to work their way to the top through import-export holdings, limited companies, playing the stock market, and nepotism. They insist on the nationalization of business transactions, that is, reserving contracts and business deals for nationals. Their doctrine is to proclaim the absolute need for nationalizing the theft of the nation. In this barren national phase, in this so-called period of austerity, their success at plundering the nation swiftly sparks anger and violence from the people. In the present international and African context, the poverty-stricken independent population achieves a social consciousness at a rapidly accelerating pace. This, the petty individualists will soon find out for themselves. In order to assimilate the culture of the oppressor and venture into his fold, the colonized subject has had to pawn some of his own intellectual possessions. For instance, one of the things he has had to assimilate is the way the colonialist bourgeoisie thinks. This is apparent in the colonized intellectual's inaptitude to engage in dialogue. For he is unable to make himself inessential when confronted with a purpose or idea. On the other hand, when he operates among the people, he is constantly awestruck. He is literally disarmed by their good faith and integrity. He is then constantly at risk of becoming a demagogue. He turns into a kind of mimic man who nods his assent to every word by the people, transformed by him into an arbiter of truth. But the fella, the unemployed, and the starving do not lay claim to truth. They do not say they represent the truth because they are the truth in their very being. During this period, the intellectual behaves objectively, like a vulgar opportunist. His maneuvering, in fact, is still at work. The people would never think of rejecting him or cutting the ground from under his feet. What the people want is for everything to be pulled together. The colonized intellectual's insertion into this human tide will find itself on hold because of his curious obsession with detail. It is not that the people are opposed to analysis. They appreciate clarification, understand the reasoning behind an argument, and like to see where they are going. But at the start of his cohabitation with the people, the colonized intellectual gives priority to detail and tends to forget the very purpose of the struggle, the defeat of colonialism. Swept along by the many facets of the struggle, he tends to concentrate on local tasks undertaken zealously but almost always too pedantically. He does not always see the overall picture. He introduces the notion of disciplines, specialized areas, and fields into that awesome mixer and grinder called a people's revolution. Committed to certain frontline issues, he tends to lose sight of the unity of the movement, and in the event of failure at the local level, he succumbs to doubt, even despair. The people, on the other hand, take a global stance from the very start. Bread and land. How do we go about getting bread and land? And this stubborn, apparently limited, narrow-minded aspect of the people is finally the most rewarding and effective working model.
So they don't think, they just act.
Well, no, I mean, he's saying that they do think. They just think big picture. They don't care about the small details. The small details will be worked out as things come to light. As the problem comes, so too it shall be solved. Yeah, but they're focused on, getting the end goal. How you're going to get there is obviously to be discovered on the way. You can't already pre-plan. You can't pre-plan a revolution, which is something I agree with. I think a lot of these people who sit around and saying, like, well, how's the revolution going to work? What's wrong with you? It's like, you don't know that.
I mean, you can't do it quote unquote, like rationally in that sense. You actually have to live it and do it inductively rather than deductively. If you try to plan it out all beforehand, I mean, what happens when some obstacle comes in your way and just totally thwarts everything? It's...
Yeah, the revolution will not be theorized.
Yep. Yeah, not only that, I mean, because of the scale of the problems, it can't be centralized in the way that people think centralization would work. Like, it's not centralized under one single authority. Rather, things may seem to be centralized under a single authority, but they're actually diffused through multiple levels of authority, multiple levels of decision making, and ultimately, people themselves are a huge part in like getting shit together and getting. Continuing, the question of truth must also be taken into consideration. For the people, only fellow nationals are ever owed the truth. No absolute truth, no discourse on the transparency of the soul can erode this position. In answer to the lie of the colonial situation, the colonized subject responds with a lie. Behavior toward fellow nationalists is open and honest, but strained and indecipherable toward the colonists. Truth is what hastens the dislocation of the colonial regime, what fosters the emergence of the nation. Truth is what protects the natives and undoes the foreigners. In the colonial context, there is no truthful behavior. And good is quite simply what hurts them most. So that's interesting. I mean, truth here is taken as, I think, seems to be taken as the liberation struggle. Such that whatever aids the struggle is whatever is true. Of course, to the rest of the world, since that's not their truth, the colonizer wants the truth of the colonizer is to colonize. But if decolonization is happening, what's happening is the untruth of their truth. Revealing the lie of the colonizer. I definitely see a bit of Hegelianism popping up there. Continuing, we have seen therefore that the Manichaeanism that first governed colonial society is maintained and intact during the period of decolonization. In fact, the colonist never ceases to be the enemy, the antagonist, in plain words, public enemy number one. The oppressor is ensconced in his sector creates the spiral of domination, exploitation, and looting. In the other sector, the colonized subject lies coiled and robbed and fuels as best he can the spiral which moves seamlessly from the shores of the colony to the palaces and docks of the metropolis. In this petrified zone, not a ripple on the surface, the palm trees sway against the clouds, the waves of the sea lap against the shore, the raw materials come and go, legitimating the colonist's presence, while more dead than alive, the colonized subject crouches forever in the same old dream. The colonist makes history, his life is an epic, an odyssey. He is invested with the very beginning. Quote, "We made this land," end quote. He is the guarantor for its existence. Quote, "If we leave, all will be lost, and this land will return to the Dark Ages," end quote. Opposite him, listless beings wasted away by fevers and consumed by ancestral customs compose a virtually petrified background to the innovative dynamism of colonial mercantilism. So here is a backlash against the European view of universal history, in which, indeed, all the way from the most progressive to the most progressive, they all saw Europe as, the maker of world history. What does Hegel say about Africa? He says, Africa is not part of history. people have done and gone and done with Africa whatever the heck they want, but it's the Europeans, it's the Greeks, it's the Romans, it's the Germanys, the Britons of the world, the United States, who have made history, and not the colonized peoples.
Well, again, it's that whole myth of progress there. That assumption that once all the white people leave, then these colonized lands will just fall into ruin. Like, they need whitey there in order to build their industry, create jobs, create roads, etc.
Oh yeah, you see it in Poland all the time. They love to bring in South Africa. Like, look, they kicked out the white man, and like the country became worse. Their crime rates went up. The violence has gone up. They killed the Boer farmers, and now they don't know how to farm. They don't grow enough food. Blah blah blah. If only they had just recognized that us white people, we run things better. It's for their benefit. It's for the benefit of the oppressed that we oppress them. It's the white man's burden. So continuing, the colonist makes history and he knows it. And because he refers constantly to the history of his metropolis, he plainly indicates that here he is the extension of this metropolis. The history he writes is therefore not the history of the country he is despoiling, but the history of his own nation's looting, raping, and starving to death. The immobility to which the colonized subject is condemned can be challenged only if he decides to put an end to the history of colonization and the history of despoliation, in order to bring to life the history of the nation, the history of decolonization. And I think that's a good place to stop, because we've been going on for an hour. But so far, so good. I'm liking it. I definitely like what he says. I don't see much theory so far, but I see a real description. He's just kind of telling the truth from a certain perspective.
I really like his writing style. I like how he's very vivid in his details.
Yeah,
definitely.
I really like most of it. There's one small section that I didn't really like that much, though. Let me scroll up. That whole section about the anti-individualism and, how everything's got to be communitarian. That obviously sounds a bit scary.
It's just Leninism, man. It's democratic centralism.
Well, I guess the other thing, the caveat that I would have with this is just how relevant, or I shouldn't say relevant, but considering how, as Zizek keeps pointing out again and again, that capitalism has become universalized since then. This text was written during these anti-colonial struggles, which was 50s, 60s, that time. I guess this is going to sound really bad, but I wonder how much of this is still holds true today, when all of these formerly colonized peoples, or neo-colonized peoples, you could say, have been forced into this capitalist mode of production, whether they want to or not. And you are seeing things like capital adapting to their indigenous cultures. So now it's no longer necessarily these communalist peoples over here are totally antagonistic to capitalism because of their culture. Now their culture and their rituals are used to reproduce capital in that way. And I don't know, I don't want to sound like I'm, some big Euro chauvinist here or whatever. I know people are going to jump on that, but I just wonder, to what extent is everything Fanon is describing, does it hold true today in a neoliberal, globalized capitalist framework where capital has been able to adapt in order to expand and reproduce.
No, I think you bring up a good point, and I think considering that we're what now, about 70 years after him, well, 60, no, almost 60 years
60.
after him, after this book was brought about, history has shown that his hopes of anti-colonialism and this kind of view didn't play out, really. Very few places in the world have maintained any such coherence of, a pre-capitalist culture that, denies the advance of capital. A few places I can imagine are, the Zapatistas in Mexico. And, even they engage in a bit of capitalism.
Well,
the other thing, of course, is like all these countries which have, kicked out whitey, very few of them have fully succeeded, since a lot of Africa, of course, is subservient to China.
A lot of it's subservient to France still. I mean, when I was living in France, we would get news coming out of France's former colonies in Africa. And of course, I mean, all this stuff was whitewashed, right? Like just how US media is all whitewashed. But I mean, you would hear stuff about like French troops in Mali, or French, French investments in Chad or something like that. So, I mean, again, like it's a neo-colonial model, and they really haven't succeeded in even kicking out their former colonizers fully.
Yeah, I remember hearing something recently about how Macron was being a dick in Burkina Faso. I forget exactly what he said.
That too. I was actually in France when the news broke about the coup attempt in Burkina Faso, and I mean, everyone knows that the French government is working behind the scenes. I mean, it's pretty obvious, but that was a pretty weird clusterfuck.
Yeah, so I guess just like the whole socialist movement, decolonialism has failed.
The whole what happened was, the white man we got out, but then, the national bourgeoisie sold out the country.
It's fine. Fanon actually talks about that in one of the future chapters. The limits of national consciousness, I think it's called.
Yeah, so as far as capital goes, it has no it doesn't care about nationality. So your national bourgeoisie don't care about the nation as such.
I mean, capital has transcended borders at this point. Like, it's transcended cultures, religions, ethnic groups, tribes. I mean, borders are just there to keep workers out. They're not there to keep capital out.
No, capital has to conquer everything. There can't be a single area left untouched.
Yep. But all right, that was good reading. I enjoyed it. We'll continue this another time. That was Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, part of the first chapter on violence. See you people who listen next time.